The Monk, A Romance Part 3 by Matthew Gregory Lewis. Chapter 11. Our foolish confidence too late we mourn, round our devoted heads the billows beat, and from our troubled view the lessening lands retreat. Peoria. All this while, Ambrosio was unconscious of the dreadful scenes which were passing so near. The execution of his designs upon Antonia employed his every thought. Hitherto, he was satisfied with the success of his plans. Antonia had drank the opiate, was buried in the vaults of St. Clare, and absolutely in his disposal. Matilda, who was well acquainted with the nature and effects of the soporific medicine, had computed that it would not cease to operate till 1 in the morning. For that hour he waited with impatience. The festival of St. Clare presented him with a favorable opportunity of consummating his crime. He was certain that the friars and nuns would be engaged in the procession, and that he had no cause to dread an interruption from appearing himself at the head of his monks. He had desired to be excused. He doubted not that, being beyond the reach of help, cut off from all the world and totally in his power, Antonia would comply with his desires. The affection which she had ever expressed for him warranted this persuasion, but he resolved that should she prove obstinate, no consideration whatever should prevent him from enjoying her. Secure from a discovery, he shuddered not at the idea of employing force. If he felt any repugnance, it arose not from a principle of shame or compassion, but from his feeling for Antonia the most sincere and ardent affection, and wishing to owe her favors to no one but herself. The monks quitted the abbey at midnight. Matilda was among the choristers and led the chaunt. Ambrosio was left by himself, and at liberty to pursue his own inclinations. Convinced that no one remained behind to watch his motions or disturb his pleasures, he now hastened to the Western Isles. His heart beating with hope not unmingled with anxiety, he crossed the garden, unlocked. The door which admitted him into the cemetery, and in a few minutes he stood before the vaults. Here he paused. He looked round him with suspicion, conscious that his business was unfit for any other eye. As he stood in hesitation, he heard the melancholy shriek of the screech owl. The wind rattled loudly against the windows of the adjacent convent, and as the current swept by him, bore with it the faint notes of the chaunt of choristers. He opened the door cautiously, as if fearing to be overheard. He entered and closed it again after him. Guided by his lamp, he threaded the long passages in whose windings Matilda had instructed him, and reached the private vault which contained his sleeping mistress. Its entrance was by no means easy to discover, but this was no obstacle to Ambrosio, who at the time of Antonia's funeral had observed it too carefully to be deceived. He found the door, which was unfastened, pushed it open, and descended into the dungeon. He approached the humble tomb in which Antonia reposed. He had provided himself with an iron crow and a pickaxe, but this precaution was unnecessary. The grate was slightly fastened on the outside. He raised it, and placing the lamp upon its ridge, bent silently over the tomb. By the side of 3 putrid, half-corrupted bodies lay the sleeping beauty. A lively red, the forerunner of returning animation, had already spread itself over her cheek, and as wrapped in her shroud, she reclined upon her funeral bier. She seemed to smile at the images of death around her, while he gazed upon their rotting bones and disgusting figures, who perhaps were once as sweet and lovely. Ambrosio thought upon Elvira, by him reduced to the same state. As the memory of that horrid act glanced upon his mind, it was clouded with a gloomy horror, yet it served but to strengthen his resolution to destroy Antonia's honor. "For your sake, fatal beauty," murmured the monk, while gazing on his devoted prey, "for your sake, have I committed this murder and sold myself to? Eternal tortures. Now you are in my power. The produce of my guilt will at least be mine. Hope not that your prayers breathe in tones of unequaled melody, your bright eyes filled with tears, and your hands lifted in supplication, as when seeking in penitence the Virgin's pardon. Hope not that your moving innocence, your beauteous grief, or all your suppliant arts shall ransom you from my embraces. Before the break of day, mine you must, and mine you shall be. He lifted her still motionless from the tomb. He seated himself upon a bank of stone, and supporting her in his arms, watched impatiently for the symptoms of returning animation. Scarcely could he command his passion sufficiently to restrain himself from enjoying her while yet insensible. His natural lust was increased in ardor by the difficulties which had opposed his satisfying it, as also by his long abstinence from woman, since from the moment of resigning her claim to his love, Matilda had exiled him from her arms forever. I am no prostitute, Ambrosio. Had she told him, when in the fullness of his lust, he demanded her favors with more than usual earnestness, I am now no more than your friend, and will not be your mistress. Cease then to solicit my complying with desires which insult me. While your heart was mine, I gloried in your embraces. Those happy times are past, my person is become indifferent to you, and 'tis necessity, not love, which makes you seek my enjoyment. I cannot yield to a request so humiliating to my pride. Suddenly deprived of pleasures, the use of which had made them an absolute want, the monk felt this restraint severely. Naturally addicted to the gratification of the senses, in the full vigor of manhood and heat of blood, he had suffered his temperament to acquire such ascendancy that his lust was become madness. Of his fondness for Antonia, none but the grosser particles remained. He longed for the possession of her person, and even the gloom of the vault, the surrounding silence, and the resistance which he expected from her. Seemed to give a fresh edge to his fierce and unbridled desires. Gradually he felt the bosom which rested against his glow with returning warmth. Her heart throbbed again, her blood flowed swifter, and her lips moved. At length she opened her eyes, but still oppressed and bewildered by the effects of the strong opiate, she closed them again immediately. Ambrosio watched her narrowly, nor permitted a movement to escape him. Perceiving that she was fully restored to existence, he caught her enraptured to his bosom, and closely pressed his lips to hers. The suddenness of his action sufficed to dissipate the fumes which obscured Antonia's reason. She hastily raised herself and cast a wild look round her. The strained images which presented themselves on every side contributed to confuse her. She put her hand to her head, as if to settle her disordered imagination. At length she took it away, and threw her eyes through the dungeon a second time. They fixed upon the abbot's face. "Where am I?" she said abruptly. "How came I here? Where is my mother? Methought I saw her. Oh, a dream, a dreadful, dreadful dream told me. But where am I? Let me go. I cannot stay here." She attempted to rise, but the monk prevented her. "Be calm, lovely Antonia," he replied. "No danger is near you. Confide in my protection. Why do you gaze on me so earnestly? Do you not know me? Not know your friend? Ambrosio, 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 My friend? Oh, yes, yes, I remember. But why am I here? Who has brought me? Why are you with me? Oh, Flora bade me beware. Here are nothing but graves, and tombs, and skeletons. This place frightens me. Good Ambrosio, take me away from it, for it recalls my fearful dream. Methought I was dead, and laid in my grave. Good Ambrosio, take me from hence. Will you not? Oh, will you not? Do not look on me thus. Your flaming eyes terrify me. Spare me, Father. Oh, spare me for God's sake. Why these terrors, Antonia? Rejoined the abbot, folding her in his arms, and covering her bosom with kisses which she in vain struggled to avoid. What fear you from me, from one who adores you? What matters it where you are? This sepulchre seems to me love's bower. This gloom is the friendly night of mystery which he spreads over our delights. Such do I think it, and such must my Antonia. Yes, my sweet girl, yes. Your veins shall glow with fire which circles in mine, and my transport shall be doubled by your sharing them. While he spoke thus, he repeated his embraces, and permitted himself the most indecent liberties. Even Antonia's ignorance was not proof against the freedom of his behavior. She was sensible of her danger, forced herself from his arms, and her shroud being her only garment, she wrapped it closely round her. "Unhand me, Father," she cried, her honest indignation tempered by alarm at her unprotected position. "Why have you brought me to this place? Its appearance freezes me with horror. Convey me from hence if you have the least sense of pity and humanity. Let me return to the house which I have quitted, I know not how, but stay here one moment longer I neither will or ought." Though the monk was somewhat startled by the resolute tone in which this speech was delivered, it produced upon him no other effect than surprise. He caught her hand, forced her upon his knee, and gazing upon her with gloating eyes, he thus replied to her: "Compose yourself, Antonia. Resistance is unavailing, and I need disavow my passion for you no longer. You are imagined dead, society is forever lost to you. I possess you here alone. You are absolutely in my power, and I burn with desires which I must either gratify or die, but I would owe my happiness to yourself, my lovely girl, my adorable Antonia. Let me instruct you in joys to which you are still a stranger, and teach you to feel those pleasures in my arms which I must soon enjoy in yours. Nay, this struggling is childish," he continued, seeing her repel his caresses and endeavor to escape from his grasp. "No aid is near, neither heaven or earth shall save you from my embraces. Yet why reject pleasures so sweet, so rapturous? No one observes us. Our loves will be a secret to all the world. Love and opportunity invite your giving loose to your passions. Yield to them, my Antonia. Yield to them, my lovely girl. Throw your arms thus fondly round me. Join your lips thus closely to mine. Amidst all her gifts, has nature denied her most precious, the sensibility of pleasure? Oh, impossible! Every feature, look, and motion declares you formed to bless and to be blessed yourself. Turn not on me those supplicating eyes. Consult your own charms. They will tell you that I am proof against entreaty. Can I relinquish these limbs so white, so soft, so delicate? These swelling breasts, round, full, and elastic? These lips fraught with such inexhaustible sweetness? Can I relinquish these? Treasures, and leave them to another's enjoyment? No, Antonia, never, never. I swear it by this kiss, and this, and this, and this." With every moment the friar's passion became more ardent, and Antonia's terror more intense. She struggled to disengage herself from his arms. Her exertions were unsuccessful, And finding that Ambrosio's conduct became still freer, she shrieked for assistance with all her strength. The aspect of the vault, the pale glimmering of the lamp, the surrounding obscurity, the sight of the tomb, and the objects of mortality which met her eyes on either side, were ill calculated to inspire her with those emotions by which the friar was agitated. Even his caresses terrified her from their fury, and created no other sentiment than fear. On the contrary, her alarm, her evident disgust, and incessant opposition seemed only to inflame the monk's desires and supply his brutality with additional strength. Antonia's shrieks were unheard, yet she continued them, nor abandoned her endeavors to escape, till exhausted and out of breath, she sank from his arms upon her knees, and once more had recourse to prayers and supplications. This attempt had no better success than the former. On the contrary, taking advantage of her situation, the ravisher threw himself by her side. He clasped her to his bosom almost lifeless with terror and faint with struggling. He stifled her cries with kisses, treated her with the rudeness of an unprincipled barbarian, proceeded from freedom to freedom, and in the violence of his lustful delirium wounded and bruised her tender limbs. Heedless of her tears, cries, and entreaties, he gradually made himself master of her person and desisted not from his prey till he had accomplished his crime and the dishonor of Antonia. Scarcely had he succeeded in his design than he shuddered at himself and the means by which it was effected. The very excess of his former eagerness to possess Antonia now contributed to inspire him with disgust, and a secret impulse made him feel how base and unmanly was the crime which he had just committed. He started hastily from her arms. She, who so lately had been the object of his adoration, now raised no other sentiment in his heart than aversion and rage. He turned away from her, or if his eyes rested upon her figure involuntarily, it was only to dart upon her looks of hate. The unfortunate had fainted ere the completion of her disgrace. She only recovered life to be sensible of her misfortune. She remained stretched upon the earth in silent despair. The tears chased each other slowly down her cheeks, and her bosom heaved with frequent sobs. Oppressed with grief, she continued for some time in this state of torpidity. At length she rose with difficulty, and dragging her feeble steps towards the door, prepared to quit the dungeon. The sound of her footsteps roused the monk from his sullen apathy. Starting from the tomb against which he reclined, while his eyes wandered over the images of corruption contained in it, he pursued the victim of his brutality, and soon overtook her. He seized her by the arm and violently forced her back into the dungeon. "Whither go you?" he cried in a stern voice. "Return this instant." Antonia trembled at the fury of his countenance. "What, would you more?" she said with timidity. "Is not my ruin completed? Am I not undone, undone forever? Is not your cruelty contented, or have I yet more to suffer? Let me depart. Let me return to my home, and weep unrestrained my shame and my affliction." "Return to your home?" repeated the monk with bitter and contemptuous mockery, then suddenly his eyes flaming with passion. "What, that you may denounce me to the world? That you may proclaim me an hypocrite, a ravisher, a betrayer, a monster of cruelty, lust, and ingratitude? No, no, no. I know well the whole weight of my offenses, well that your complaints would be too just. And my crimes too notorious. You shall not from hence to tell Madrid that I am a villain, that my conscience is loaded with sins which make me despair of heaven's pardon. Wretched girl, you must stay here with me. Here amidst these lonely tombs, these images of death, these rotting, loathsome, corrupted bodies, here shall you stay and witness my sufferings. witness what it is to die in the horrors of despondency, and breathe the last groan in blasphemy and curses. And who am I to thank for this? What seduced me into crimes, whose bare remembrance makes me shudder? Fatal witch, was it not thy beauty? Have you not plunged my soul into infamy? Have you not made me a perjured hypocrite, a ravisher, an assassin? Nay, at this moment does not that angel look bid me despair of God's forgiveness? Oh! When I stand before his judgment throne, that look will suffice to damn me. You will tell my judge that you were happy till I saw you, that you were innocent, till I polluted you. You will come with those tearful eyes, those cheeks pale and ghastly, those hands lifted in supplication as, when you sop from me that mercy which I gave not, then will my perdition be certain. Then will come your mother's ghost, and hurl me down into the dwellings of fiends and frayings and ephries and everlasting torments. And 'tis you who will accuse me. 'Tis you who will cause my eternal anguish. You, wretched girl, you. As he thundered out these words, he violently grasped Antonia's arm and spurned the earth with delirious fury. Supposing his brain to be turned, Antonia sank in terror upon her knees. She lifted up her hands, and her voice almost died away ere she could give it utterance. Spare me, she murmured with difficulty. Silence, cried the friar madly, and dashed her upon the ground. He quitted her and paced the dungeon with a wild and disordered air. His eyes rolled fearfully. Antonia trembled whenever she met their gaze. He seemed to meditate on something horrible, and she gave up all hopes of escaping from the sepulchre with life. Yet in harboring this idea, she did him injustice. Amidst the horror and disgust to which his soul was a prey, pity for his victim still held a place in it. The storm of passion once over, he would have given worlds, had he possessed them, to have restored to her that innocence of which his unbridled lust had deprived her. Of the desires which had urged him to the crime, no trace was left in his bosom. The wealth of India would not have tempted him to a second enjoyment of her person. His nature seemed to revolt at the very idea, and fain would he have wiped from his memory the scene which had just passed. As his gloomy rage abated, in proportion did his compassion augment for Antonia. He stopped, and would have spoken to her words of comfort, but he knew not from whence to draw them, and remained gazing upon her with mournful wildness. Her situation seemed so hopeless, so woebegone, as to baffle mortal power to relieve her. What could he do for her? Her peace of mind was lost, her honor irreparably ruined. She was cut off forever from society, nor dared he give her back to it. He was conscious that were she to appear in the world again, his guilt would be revealed and his punishment inevitable. To one so laden with crimes, death came armed with double terrors. Yet should he restore Antonia to light and stand the chance of her betraying him, how miserable a prospect would present itself before her. She could never hope to be creditably established. She would be marked with infamy and condemned to sorrow and solitude for the remainder of her existence. What was the alternative? A resolution far more terrible for Antonia, but which at least would ensure the abbot's safety. He determined to leave the world persuaded of her death, and to retain her a captive in this gloomy prison. There, he proposed to visit her every night, to bring her food, to profess his penitence, and mingle his tears with hers. The monk felt that, This resolution was unjust and cruel, but it was his only means to prevent Antonia from publishing his guilt and her own infamy. Should he release her, he could not depend upon her silence. His offense was too flagrant to permit his hoping for her forgiveness. Besides, her reappearing would excite universal curiosity, and the violence of her affliction would prevent her from concealing its cause. He determined, therefore, that Antonia should remain a prisoner in the dungeon. He approached her with confusion painted on his countenance. He raised her from the ground. Her hand trembled as he took it, and he dropped it again as if he had touched a serpent. Nature seemed to recoil at the touch. He felt himself at once repulsed from and attracted towards her, yet could account for neither sentiment. There was something in her look which penetrated him with horror, and though his understanding was still ignorant of it, conscience pointed out to him the whole extent of his crime. In hurried accents, yet the gentlest he could, find, while his eye was averted and his voice scarcely audible, he strove to console her under a misfortune which now could not be avoided. He declared himself sincerely penitent, and that he would gladly shed a drop of his blood for every tear which his barbarity had forced from her. Wretched and hopeless, Antonia listened to him in silent grief, but when he announced her confinement in the sepulchre, that dreadful doom to which even death seemed preferable, roused her from her insensibility at once. To linger out a life of misery in a narrow, loathsome cell, known to exist by no human being save her ravisher, surrounded by mouldering corpses, breathing the pestilential air of corruption, never more to behold the light or drink the pure gale of heaven, the idea was more terrible than she could support. It conquered even her abhorrence of the friar. Again, she sank upon her knees. She besought his compassion in terms the most pathetic and urgent. She promised, would he but restore her to liberty, to conceal her injuries from the world, to assign any reason for her reappearance. Which he might judge proper, and in order to prevent the least suspicion from falling upon him, she offered to quit Madrid immediately. Her entreaties were so urgent as to make a considerable impression upon the monk. He reflected that as her person no longer excited his desires, he had no interest in keeping her concealed as he had at first intended, that he was adding a fresh injury to those which she had already suffered, and that if she adhered to her promises, whether she was confined or at liberty, his life and reputation were equally secure. On the other hand, he trembled lest in her affliction Antonia should unintentionally break her engagement, or that her excessive simplicity and ignorance of deceit should permit someone more artful to surprise her secret. However well founded were these apprehensions, compassion and a sincere wish to repair his fault as much as possible solicited his complying with the prayers of his suppliant. The difficulty of coloring Antonia's unexpected return to life, after her supposed death and public interment, was the only point which kept him irresolute. He was still pondering on the means of removing this obstacle when he heard the sound of feet approaching with precipitation. The door of the vault was thrown open, and Matilda rushed in, evidently much confused and terrified. On seeing a stranger enter, Antonia uttered a cry of joy, but her hopes of receiving succor from him were soon dissipated. The supposed novice, without expressing the least surprise at finding a woman alone with the monk in so strange a place and at so late an hour, addressed him thus without losing a moment. "What is to be done, Ambrosio? We are lost, unless some speedy means is found of dispelling the rioters. Ambrosio, the convent of St. Clare is on fire. The prioress has fallen a victim to the fury of the mob. Already is the abbey menaced with a similar fate. Alarmed at the threats of the people, the monks seek for you. Everywhere. They imagine that your authority alone will suffice to calm this disturbance. No one knows what has become of you, and your absence creates universal astonishment and despair. I profited by the confusion and fled hither to warn you of the danger. This will soon be remedied, answered the abbot. I will hasten back to my cell. A trivial reason will account for my having been missed. Impossible, rejoined Matilda. The sepulchre is filled with archers. Lorenzo de Medina, with several officers of the Inquisition, searches through the vaults and pervades every passage. You will be intercepted in your flight. Your reasons for being at this late hour in the sepulchre will be examined. Antonia will be found, and then you are undone forever. Lorenzo de Medina, officers of the Inquisition, what brings them here? Seek they for me? Am I then suspected? Oh, speak, Matilda, answer me in pity. As yet they do not think of you, but I fear that they will ere long. Your only chance of escaping their notice rests upon the difficulty of exploring this vault. The door is artfully hidden, haply it may not be observed, and we may remain concealed till the search is over. But Antonia, should the inquisitors draw near, and her cries be heard? Thus I remove that danger, interrupted Matilda. At the same time, drawing a poignard, she rushed upon her devoted prey. Hold, hold, cried Ambrosio, seizing her hand, and wresting from it the already lifted weapon. What would you do, cruel woman? The unfortunate has already suffered but too much, thanks to your pernicious counsels. Would to God that I had never followed them. Would to God that I had never seen your face. Matilda darted upon him a look of scorn. Absurd! She exclaimed with an air of passion and majesty which impressed the monk with awe. After robbing her of all that made it dear, can you fear to deprive her of a life so miserable? But 'tis well. Let her live to convince you of your folly. I abandon you to your evil destiny. I disclaim your alliance. Who trembles to commit so insignificant a crime deserves not my protection. Hark, hark! Ambrosio, hear you not the archers? They come, and your destruction is inevitable. At this moment the abbot heard the sound of distant voices. He flew to close the door, on whose concealment his safety depended, and which Matilda had neglected to fasten. Ere he could reach it, he saw Antonia glide suddenly by him, rush through the door, and fly towards the noise with the swiftness of an arrow. She had listened attentively to Matilda. She heard Lorenzo's name. Mentioned, and resolved to risk everything to throw herself under his protection. The door was open. The sounds convinced her that the archers could be at no great distance. She mustered up her little remaining strength, rushed by the monk ere he perceived her design, and bent her course rapidly towards the voices. As soon as he recovered from his first surprise, the abbot failed not to pursue her. In vain did Antonia redouble her speed and stretch every nerve to the utmost. Her enemy gained upon her every moment. She heard his steps close after her, and felt the heat of his breath glow upon her neck. He overtook her. He twisted his hand in the ringlets of her streaming hair, and attempted to drag her back with him to the dungeon. Antonia resisted with all her strength. She folded her arms round a pillar which supported the roof, and shrieked loudly for assistance. In vain did the monk strive to threaten her to silence. "Help!" she continued to exclaim. "Help! Help! For God's sake!" Quickened by her cries, the sound of footsteps was heard approaching. The abbot expected every moment to see the inquisitors arrive. Antonia still resisted, and he now enforced her silence by means the most horrible and inhuman. He still grasped Matilda's dagger. Without allowing himself a moment's reflection, he raised it. and plunged it twice in the bosom of Antonia. She shrieked and sank upon the ground. The monk endeavored to bear her away with him, but she still embraced the pillar firmly. At that instant the light of approaching torches flashed upon the walls. Dreading a discovery, Ambrosio was compelled to abandon his victim and hastily fled back to the vault where he had left Matilda. He fled not unobserved. Don Ramirez, happening to arrive the first, perceived a female bleeding upon the ground and a man flying from the spot whose confusion betrayed him for the murderer. He instantly pursued the fugitive with some part of the archers, while the others remained with Lorenzo too. Protect the wounded stranger. They raised her and supported her in their arms. She had fainted from excess of pain, but soon gave signs of returning life. She opened her eyes, and on lifting up her head, the quantity of fair hair fell back which till then had obscured her features. "God Almighty, it is Antonia!" Such was Lorenzo's exclamation, while he snatched her from the attendant's arms and clasped her in his own. Though aimed by an uncertain hand, the poniard had answered but too well the purpose of its employer. The wounds were mortal, and Antonia was conscious that she never could recover. Yet the few moments which remained for her were moments of happiness. The concern expressed upon Lorenzo's countenance, the frantic fondness of his complaints, and his earnest inquiries respecting her wounds, convinced her beyond a doubt that his affections were her own. She would not be removed from the vaults, fearing lest motion should only hasten her death, and she was unwilling to lose those moments which she passed in receiving proofs of Lorenzo's love and assuring him of her own. She told him that had she still been undefiled, she might have lamented the loss of life, but that deprived of honor and branded with shame, death was to her a blessing. She could not have been his wife, and that hope being denied her, she resigned herself to the grave without one sigh of regret. She bade him take courage, conjured him not to abandon himself to fruitless sorrow, and declared that she mourned to leave nothing in the whole world but him. While every sweet accent increased rather than lightened Lorenzo's grief, she continued to converse with him till the moment of dissolution. Her voice grew faint and scarcely audible. A thick cloud spread itself over her eyes. Her heart beat slow and irregular, and every instant seemed to announce that her fate was near at hand. She lay, her head reclining upon Lorenzo's bosom, and her lips still murmuring to him words of comfort. She was interrupted by the convent bell, as tolling at a distance it struck the hour. Suddenly Antonia's eyes sparkled with celestial brightness. Her frame seemed to have received new strength and animation. She started from her lover's arms. 3 o'clock, she cried. Mother, I come. She clasped her hands and sank lifeless upon the ground. Lorenzo in agony threw himself beside her. He tore his hair, beat his breast, and refused to be separated from the corpse. At length, his force being exhausted, he suffered himself to be led from the vault and was conveyed to the Palace de Medina, scarcely more alive than the unfortunate Antonia. In the meanwhile, though closely pursued, Ambrosio succeeded in regaining the vault. The door was already fastened when Don Ramirez arrived, and much time elapsed ere the fugitive's retreat was discovered, but nothing can resist perseverance. Though so artfully concealed, the door could not escape the vigilance of the archers. They forced it open and entered the vault, to the infinite dismay of Ambrosio and his companion. The monk's confusion, his attempt to hide himself, his rapid flight, and the blood sprinkled upon his clothes left no room to doubt his being Antonia's murderer. but when he was recognized for the immaculate Ambrosio, the man of holiness, the idol of Madrid, the faculties of the spectators were chained up in surprise, and scarcely could they persuade themselves that what they saw was no vision. The abbot strove not to vindicate himself, but preserved a sullen silence. He was secured and bound. The same precaution was taken with Matilda, her cowl being removed. The delicacy of her features and profusion of her golden hair betrayed her sex, and this incident created fresh amazement. The dagger was also found in the tomb, where the monk had thrown it, and the dungeon having undergone thorough search, the two culprits were conveyed to the prisons of the Inquisition. Don Ramirez took care that the populace should remain ignorant both of the crimes and profession of the captives. He feared a repetition of the riots which had followed the apprehending the prioress of St. Clare. He contented himself with stating to the Capuchins the guilt of their superior. To avoid the shame of a public accusation, and dreading the popular fury from which they had already saved their abbey with much difficulty, the monks readily permitted the inquisitors to search their mansion without noise. No fresh discoveries were made. The effects found in the abbot's and Matilda's cells were seized and carried to the Inquisition to be produced in evidence. Everything else remained in its former position, and order and tranquillity once more prevailed through Madrid. St. Clare's convent was completely ruined by the united ravages of the mob and conflagration. Nothing remained of it but the principal walls, whose thickness and solidity had preserved them from the flames. The nuns who had belonged to it were obliged, in consequence, to disperse themselves into other societies. But the prejudice against them ran high, and the superiors were very unwilling to admit them. However, most of them being related to families the most distinguished for their riches, birth, and power, the several convents were compelled to receive them, though they did it with a very ill grace. This prejudice was extremely false and unjustifiable. After a close investigation, it was proved that all in the convent were persuaded of the death of Agnes, except the 4 nuns whom Saint Ursula had pointed out. These had fallen victims to the popular fury, as had also several who were perfectly innocent and unconscious of the whole affair. Blinded by resentment, the mob had sacrificed every nun who fell into their hands. They who escaped were entirely indebted to the Duke d'Eulah. Medina's prudence and moderation. Of this they were conscious, and felt for that nobleman a proper sense of gratitude. Virginia was not the most sparing of her thanks. She wished equally to make a proper return for his attentions, and to obtain the good graces of Lorenzo's uncle. In this she easily succeeded. The Duke beheld her beauty with wonder and admiration, and while his eyes were enchanted with her form, the sweetness of her manners, and her tender concern for the suffering nun prepossessed his heart in her favor. This Virginia had discernment enough to perceive, and she redoubled her attention to the invalid. When he parted from her at the door of her father's palace, the Duke entreated permission to inquire occasionally after her health. His request was readily granted. Virginia assured him that the Marquis de Villafranca would be proud of an opportunity to thank him in person for the protection afforded to her. They now separated, he enchanted with her beauty and gentleness, and she much pleased with him, and more with his nephew. On entering the palace, Virginia's first care was to summon the family physician and take care of her unknown charge. Her mother hastened to share with her the charitable office. Alarmed by the riots and trembling for his daughter's safety, who was his only child, the Marquis had flown to St. Clare's convent and was still employed in seeking her. Messengers were now dispatched on all sides to inform him that he would find her safe at his hotel and desire him to hasten thither immediately. His absence gave Virginia liberty to bestow her whole attention upon her patient. And though much disordered herself by the adventures of the night, no persuasion could induce her to quit the bedside of the sufferer. Her constitution being much enfeebled by want and sorrow, it was some time before the stranger was restored to her senses. She found great difficulty in swallowing the medicines prescribed to her, but this obstacle being removed, she easily conquered her disease, which proceeded from nothing but weakness. The attention which was paid her, the wholesome food to which she had been long a stranger, and her joy at being restored to liberty, to society, and, as she dared to hope, to love, all this combined to her speedy re-establishment. From the first moment of knowing her, her melancholy situation, her sufferings almost unparalleled, had engaged the affections of her amiable hostess. Virginia felt for her the most lively interest. But how was she delighted when her guest, being sufficiently recovered to relate her history, she recognized in the captive nun the sister of Lorenzo. This victim of monastic cruelty was indeed no other than the unfortunate Agnes. During her abode in the convent, she had been well known to Virginia, but her emaciated form, her features altered by affliction, her death universally credited, and her overgrown and matted hair which hung over her face and bosom in disorder at first had prevented her being recollected. The prioress had put every artifice in practice to induce Virginia to take the veil, for the heiress of Villafranca would have been no despicable acquisition. Her seeming kindness and unremitted attention so far succeeded that her young relation began to think seriously upon compliance. Better instructed in the disgust and ennui of a monastic life, Agnes had penetrated the designs of the domina. She trembled for the innocent girl and endeavored to make her sensible of her error. She painted in their true colors the numerous inconveniencies attached to a convent, the continued restraint, the low jealousies, the petty intrigues, the servile court and gross flattery expected by the superior. She then bade Virginia reflect on the brilliant prospect which presented itself before her, the idol of her parents, the admiration of Madrid, endowed by nature and education with every perfection of person and mind. She might look forward to an establishment the most fortunate. Her riches furnished her with the means of exercising in their fullest extent, charity, and benevolence, those virtues so dear to her, and her stay in the world would enable her discovering objects worthy her protection, which could not be done in the seclusion of a convent. Her persuasions induced Virginia to lay aside all thoughts of the veil, but another argument, not used by Agnes, had more weight with her than all the others put together. She had seen Lorenzo when he visited his sister at the grate. His person pleased her, and her conversations with Agnes generally used to terminate in some question about her brother. She who doted upon Lorenzo wished for no better than an opportunity to trumpet out his praise. She spoke of him in terms of rapture, and to convince her auditor how just were his sentiments, how cultivated his mind, and elegant his expressions, she showed her at different times the letters which she received from him. She soon perceived that from these communications the heart of her young friend had imbibed impressions which she was far from intending to give, but was truly happy to discover. She could not have wished her brother a more desirable union, heiress of Villafranca. Virtuous, affectionate, beautiful, and accomplished, Virginia seemed calculated to make him happy. She sounded her brother upon the subject, though without mentioning names or circumstances. He assured her in his answers that his heart and hand were totally disengaged, and she thought that upon these grounds she might proceed without danger. She in consequence endeavored to strengthen the dawning passion of her friend. Lorenzo was made the constant topic of her discourse, and the avidity with which her auditor listened, the sighs which frequently escaped from her bosom, and the eagerness with which, upon any digression, she brought back the conversation to the subject whence it had wandered, sufficed to convince Agnes that her brother's addresses would be far from disagreeable. She at length ventured to mention her wishes to the Duke. Though a stranger to the lady herself, he knew enough of her situation to think her worthy his nephew's hand. It was agreed between him and his niece that she should insinuate the idea to Lorenzo, and she only waited his return to Madrid to propose her friend to him as his bride. The unfortunate events which took place in the interim prevented her from executing her design. Virginia wept her loss sincerely, both as a companion and as the only person to whom she could speak of Lorenzo. Her passion continued to prey upon her heart in secret, and she had almost determined to confess her sentiments to her mother when accident once more threw their object in her way. The sight of him so near her, his politeness, his compassion, his intrepidity, had combined to give new ardor to her affection. When she now found her friend and advocate restored to her, she looked upon her as a gift from heaven. She ventured to cherish the hope of being united to Lorenzo, and resolved to use with him his sister's influence. Supposing that before her death Agnes might possibly have made the proposal, the Duke had placed all his nephew's hints of marriage to Virginia's account. Consequently, he gave them the most favorable reception. On returning to his hotel, the relation given him of Antonia's death and Lorenzo's behavior on the occasion made evident his mistake. He lamented the circumstances, but the unhappy girl being effectually out of the way, he trusted that his designs would yet be executed. 'Tis true that Lorenzo's situation just then ill suited him for a bridegroom. His hopes disappointed at the moment when he expected to realize them, and the dreadful and sudden death of his mistress had affected him very severely. The Duke found him upon the bed of sickness. His attendants expressed serious apprehensions for his life, but the uncle entertained not the same fears. He was of opinion, and not unwisely, that men have died and worms have eat them, but not for love. He therefore flattered himself that however deep might be the impression made upon his nephew's heart, time and Virginia would be able to efface it. He now hastened to the afflicted youth and endeavored to console him. He sympathized in his distress, but encouraged him to resist the encroachments of despair. He allowed that he could not but feel shocked at an event so terrible, nor could he blame his sensibility. But he besought him not to torment himself with vain regrets, and rather to struggle with affliction and preserve his life, if not for his own sake, at least for the sake of those who were fondly attached to him. While he labored thus to make Lorenzo forget Antonia's loss, the Duke paid his court assiduously to Virginia, and seized every opportunity to advance his nephew's interest in her heart. It may easily be expected that Agnes was not long without inquiring after Don Raymond. She was shocked to hear the wretched situation to which grief had reduced him, yet she could not help exulting secretly when she reflected that his illness proved the sincerity of his love. The Duke undertook the office himself, of announcing to the invalid the happiness which awaited him. Though he omitted no precaution to prepare him for such an event, at this sudden change from despair to happiness, Raymond's transports were so violent as white nearly to have proved fatal to him. These once past, the tranquillity of his mind, the assurance of felicity, and above all, the presence of Agnes, who was no sooner re-established by the care of Virginia and the Marchioness, than she hastened to attend her lover, soon enabled him to overcome the effects of his late dreadful malady. The calm of his soul communicated itself to his body, and he recovered with such rapidity as to create universal surprise. No so Lorenzo. Antonia's death, accompanied with such terrible circumstances, weighed upon his mind heavily. He was worn down to a shadow. Nothing could give him pleasure. He was persuaded with difficulty to swallow nourishment sufficient for the support of life, and a consumption was apprehended. The society of Agnes formed his only comfort. Though accident had never permitted their being much together, he entertained for her a sincere friendship and attachment. Perceiving how necessary she was to him, she seldom quitted his chamber. She listened to his complaints with unwearied attention, and soothed him by the gentleness of her manners and by sympathizing with his distress. She still inhabited the Palace de Villafranca, the possessors of which treated her with marked affection. The Duke had intimated to the Marquis his wishes respecting Virginia. The match was unexceptionable. Lorenzo was heir to his uncle's immense property, and was distinguished in Madrid for his agreeable person, extensive knowledge, and propriety of conduct. Add to this, that the Marchioness had discovered how strong was her daughter's prepossession in his favor. In consequence, the Duke's proposal was accepted without hesitation. Every precaution was taken to induce Lorenzo's seeing the lady with those sentiments which she so well merited to excite. In her visits to her brother Agnes was frequently accompanied by the Marchioness, and as soon as he was able to move into his antechamber, Virginia, under her mother's protection, was sometimes permitted to express her wishes for his recovery. This she did with such delicacy the manner in which she mentioned Antonia was so tender and soothing, and when she lamented her rival's melancholy fate, her bright eyes shone so beautiful through her tears that Lorenzo could not behold or listen to her without emotion. His relations, as well as the lady, perceived that with every day her society seemed to give him fresh pleasure, and that he spoke of her in terms of stronger admiration. However, they prudently kept their observations to themselves. No word was dropped which might lead him to suspect their designs. They continued their former conduct and attention, and left time to ripen into a warmer sentiment, the friendship which he already felt for Virginia. In the meanwhile, her visits became more frequent, and latterly there was scarce a day of which she did not pass some part by the side of Lorenzo's couch. He gradually regained his strength, but the progress of his recovery was slow and doubtful. One evening he seemed to be in better spirits than usual. Agnes and her lover, the Duke, Virginia and her parents were sitting round him. He now for the first time entreated his sister to inform him how she had escaped the effects of the poison which Saint Ursula had seen her swallow. Fearful of recalling those scenes to his mind in which Antonia had perished, she had hitherto concealed from him the history of her sufferings. As he now started the subject himself, and thinking that perhaps the narrative of her sorrows might draw him from the contemplation of those on which he dwelt too constantly, she immediately complied with his request. The rest of the company had already heard her story, but the interest which all present felt for its heroine made them anxious to hear it repeated. The whole society seconding Lorenzo's entreaties, Agnes obeyed. She first recounted the discovery which had taken place in the Abbey chapel, the domina's resentment, and the midnight scene of which Saint Ursula had been a concealed witness. Though the nun had already described this latter event, Agnes now related it more circumstantially and at large, after which she proceeded in her narrative as follows. Conclusion of the history of Agnes de Medina. My supposed death was attended with the greatest agonies. Those moments, which I believed my last, were embittered by the domina's assurances that I could not escape perdition, and as my eyes closed, I heard her rage exhale itself in curses on my offense. The horror of this situation, of a deathbed from which hope was banished, of a sleep from which I was only to wake to find myself the prey of flames and furies, was more dreadful than I can describe. When animation revived in me, my soul was still impressed with these terrible ideas. I looked round with fear, expecting to behold the ministers of divine vengeance. For the first hour, my senses were so bewildered and my brain so dizzy that I strove in vain to arrange the strange images which floated in wild confusion before me. If I endeavored to raise myself from the ground, the wandering of my head deceived me. Everything around me seemed to rock, and I sank once more upon the earth. My weak and dazzled eyes were unable to bear a nearer approach to a gleam of light which I saw trembling above me. I was compelled to close them again and remain motionless in the same posture. A full hour elapsed before I was sufficiently myself to examine the surrounding objects. When I did examine them, what terror filled my bosom! I found myself extended upon a sort of wicker couch. It had 6 handles to it, which doubtless had served the nuns to convey me to my grave. I was covered with a linen cloth. Several faded flowers were strewn over me. On one side lay a small wooden crucifix, on the other a rosary of large beads. 4 low narrow walls confined me. The top was also covered, and in it was practiced a small grated door. Through this was admitted the little air which circulated in this miserable place. A faint glimmering of light which streamed through the bars permitted me to distinguish the surrounding horrors. I was oppressed by a noisome, suffocating smell, and perceiving that the grated door was unfastened, I thought that I might possibly effect my escape. As I raised myself with this design, my hand rested upon something soft. I grasped it and advanced it towards the light. Almighty God! What was my disgust, my consternation! In spite of its putridity and the worms which preyed upon it, I perceived a corrupted human head and recognized the features of a nun who had died some months before. I threw it from me and sank almost lifeless upon my bier. When my strength returned, this circumstance, and the consciousness of being surrounded by the loathsome and mouldering bodies of my companions, increased my desire to escape from my fearful prison. I again moved towards the light. The grated door was within my reach. I lifted it without difficulty. Probably it had been left unclosed to facilitate my quitting the dungeon. Aiding myself by the irregularity of the walls, some of whose stones projected beyond the rest, I contrived to ascend them and drag myself out of my prison. I now found myself in a vault tolerably spacious. Several tombs, similar in appearance to that whence I had just escaped, were ranged along the sides in order, and seemed to be considerably sunk within the earth. A sepulchral lamp was suspended from the roof by an iron chain and shed a gloomy light through the dungeon. Emblems of death were seen on every side. Skulls, shoulder blades, thigh bones, and other leavings of mortality were scattered upon the dewy ground. Each tomb was ornamented with a large crucifix, and in one corner stood a wooden statue of St. Clare. To these objects I had first paid no attention. A door, the only outlet from the vault, had attracted my eyes. I hastened towards it, having wrapped my winding sheet closely round me. I pushed against the door, and to my inexpressible terror found that it was fastened on the outside. I guessed immediately that the prioress, mistaking the nature of the liquor which she had compelled me to drink, instead of poison, had administered a strong opiate. From this I concluded that being to all appearance dead, I had received the rites of burial, and that deprived of the power of making my existence known, it would be my fate to expire of hunger. This idea penetrated me with horror, not merely for my own sake, but that of the innocent creature who still lived within my bosom. I again endeavored to open the door, but it resisted all my efforts. I stretched my voice to the extent of its compass and shrieked for aid. I was remote from the hearing of everyone. No friendly voice replied to mine. A profound and melancholy silence prevailed through the vault, and I despaired of liberty, My long abstinence from food now began to torment me. The tortures which hunger inflicted on me were the most painful and insupportable, yet they seemed to increase with every hour which passed over my head. Sometimes I threw myself upon the ground and rolled upon it wild and desperate. Sometimes starting up, I returned to the door, again strove to force it open, and repeated my fruitless cries for succor. Often was I on the point of striking my temple against the sharp corner of some monument, dashing out my brains, and thus terminating my woes at once, but still the remembrance of my baby vanquished my resolution. I trembled at a deed which equally endangered my child's existence and my own. Then would I vent my anguish in loud exclamations and passionate complaints. And then again, my strength failing me, silent and hopeless, I would sit me down upon the base of St. Clare's statue, fold my arms, and abandon myself to sullen despair. Thus passed several wretched hours. Death advanced towards me with rapid strides, and I expected that every succeeding moment would be that of my dissolution. Suddenly a neighboring tomb caught my eye. A basket stood upon it, which till then I had not observed. I started from my seat. I made towards it as swiftly as my exhausted frame would permit. How eagerly did I seize the basket, on finding it to contain a loaf of coarse bread and a small bottle of water. I threw myself with avidity upon these humble aliments. They had to all appearance been placed in the vault for several days. The bread was hard and the water tainted, yet never did I taste food to me so delicious. When the cravings of appetite were satisfied, I busied myself with conjectures upon this new circumstance. I debated whether the basket had been placed there with a view to my necessity. Hope answered my doubts in the affirmative. Yet who could guess me to be in need of such assistance? If my existence was known, why was I detained in this gloomy vault? If I was kept a prisoner, what meant the ceremony of committing me to the tomb? Or if I was doomed to perish with hunger, to whose pity was I indebted for provisions placed within my reach? A friend would not have kept my dreadful punishment a secret. Neither did it seem probable that an enemy would have taken pains to supply me with the means of existence. Upon the whole, I was inclined to think that the Dominus' designs upon my life had been discovered by some one of my partisans in the convent, who had found means to substitute an opiate for poison, that she had furnished me with food to support me till she could effect my delivery, and but she was then employed in giving intelligence to my relations of my danger, and pointing out a way to release me from captivity. Yet why then was the quality of my provisions so coarse? How could my friend have entered the vault without the Domina's knowledge? And if she had entered, why was the door fastened so carefully? These reflections staggered me, yet still this idea was the most favorable to my hopes, and I dwelt upon it in preference. My meditations were interrupted by the sound of distant footsteps. They approached, but slowly. Rays of light now darted through the crevices of the door. Uncertain whether the persons who advanced came to relieve me, or were conducted by some other motive to the vault, I failed not to attract their notice by loud cries for help. Still the sounds drew near, the light grew stronger. At length, with inexpressible pleasure, I heard the key turning in the lock. Persuaded that my deliverance was at hand, I flew towards the door with a shriek of joy. It opened, but all my hopes of escape died away when the prioress appeared, followed by the same 4 nuns who had been witnesses of my supposed death. They bore torches in their hands and gazed upon me in fearful silence. I started back in terror. The Domina descended into the vault, as did also her companions. She bent upon me a stern, resentful eye, but expressed no surprise at finding me still living. She took the seat which I had just quitted. The door was again closed, and the nuns ranged themselves behind their superior, while the glare of their torches, dimmed by the vapors and dampness of the vault, gilded with cold beams the surrounding monuments. For some moments all preserved a dead and solemn silence. I stood at some distance from the prioress. At length she beckoned me to advance. Trembling at the severity of her aspect, my strength scarce sufficed me to obey her. I drew near, but my limbs were unable to support their burthen. I sank upon my knees. I clasped my hands and lifted them up to her for mercy, but had no power to articulate a syllable. She gazed upon me with angry eyes. "Do I see a penitent or a criminal?" she said at length. "Are those hands raised in contrition for your crimes or in fear of meeting their punishment? Do those tears acknowledge the justice of your doom, or only solicit mitigation of your sufferings? I fear me 'tis the latter." She paused, but kept her eye still fixed upon mine. "Take courage," she continued. "I wish not for your death, but your repentance. The draught which I administered was no poison, but an opiate. My intention in deceiving you was to make you feel the agonies of a guilty conscience, had death overtaken you suddenly, while your crimes were still unrepented. You have suffered those agonies. I have brought you to be familiar with the sharpness of death, and I trust that your momentary anguish will prove to you an eternal benefit. It is not my design to destroy your immortal soul, or bid you seek the grave, burthened with the weight of sins unexpiated. No, daughter, far from it. I will purify you with wholesome chastisement, and furnish you with full leisure for contrition and remorse. Hear then my sentence. The ill-judged zeal of your friends delayed its execution, but cannot now prevent it. All Madrid believes you to be no more. Your relations are thoroughly persuaded of your death, and the nuns your partisans have assisted at your funeral. Your existence can never be suspected. I have taken such precautions as must render it an impenetrable mystery. Then abandon all thoughts of a world from which you are eternally separated, and employ the few hours which are allowed you in preparing for the next." This exordium led me to expect something terrible. I trembled and would have spoken to deprecate her wrath, but a motion of the domina commanded me to be silent. She proceeded. Though of late years unjustly neglected, and now opposed by many of our misguided sisters, whom heaven convert, it is my intention to revive the laws of our order in their full force. That against incontinence is severe, but no more than so monstrous an offense demands. Submit to it, daughter, without resistance. You will find the benefit of patience and resignation in a better life than this. Listen then to the sentence of St. Clare. Beneath these vaults there exist prisons, intended to receive such criminals as yourself. Artfully is their entrance concealed, and she who enters them must resign all hopes of liberty. Thither must you now be conveyed. Food shall be supplied you, but not sufficient for the indulgence of appetite. You shall have just enough to keep together body and soul, and its quality shall be the simplest and coarsest. Weep, daughter, weep, and moisten your bread with your tears. God knows that you have ample cause for sorrow. Chained down in one of these secret dungeons, shut out from the world and light forever, with no comfort but religion, no society. But repentance, thus must you groan away the remainder of your days. Such are St. Clare's orders. Submit to them without repining. Follow me. Thunderstruck at this barbarous decree, my little remaining strength abandoned me. I answered only by falling at her feet and bathing them with tears. The domina, unmoved by my affliction, rose from her seat with a stately air. She repeated her commands in an absolute tone, but my excessive faintness made me unable to obey her. Mariana and Alice raised me from the ground and carried me forwards in their arms. The prioress moved on, leaning upon Violante, and Camilla preceded her with a torch. Thus passed our sad procession along the passages, in silence only broken by my sighs and groans. We stopped before the principal shrine of St. Clare. The statue was removed from its pedestal, though how I knew not. The nuns afterwards raised an iron grate till then concealed by the image, and let it fall on the other side with a loud crash. The awful sound, repeated by the vaults above and caverns below me, roused me from the despondent apathy in which I had been plunged. I looked before me. An abyss presented itself to my affrighted eyes, and a steep and narrow staircase, whither my conductors were leading me. I shrieked and started back. I implored compassion, rent the air with my cries, and summoned both heaven and earth to my assistance. In vain. I was hurried down the staircase and forced into one of the cells which lined the cavern's sides. My blood ran cold as I gazed upon this melancholy abode. The cold vapors hovering in the air, the walls green with damp, the bed of straw so forlorn and comfortless, the chain destined to bind me forever to my prison, and the reptiles of every description which, as the torches advanced towards them, I descried hurrying to their retreats, struck my heart with terrors almost too exquisite for nature to bear. Driven by despair to madness, I burst suddenly from the nuns who held me. I threw myself upon my knees before the prioress, and besought her mercy in the most passionate and frantic terms. "If not on me," said I, "look at least with pity on that innocent being whose life is attached to mine. Great is my crime, but let not my child suffer for it. My baby has committed no fault. Oh, spare me for the sake of my unborn offspring, whom ere it tastes life. Your severity dooms to destruction." The prioress drew back haughtily. She forced her habit from my grasp, as if my touch had been contagious. "What?" she exclaimed with an exasperated air. "What? Dare you plead for the produce of your shame? Shall a creature be permitted to live, conceived in guilt so monstrous? Abandoned woman, speak for him no more. Better that the wretch should perish than live, begotten in perjury, incontinence, and pollution. It cannot fail to prove a prodigy of vice. Hear me, thou guilty. Expect no mercy from me either for yourself or brat. Rather pray that death may seize you before you produce it, or if it must see the light, that its eyes may immediately be closed. Again forever. No aid shall be given you in your labor. Bring your offspring into the world yourself. Feed it yourself, nurse it yourself, bury it yourself. God grant that the latter may happen soon, lest you receive comfort from the fruit of your iniquity. This inhuman speech, the threats which it contained, the dreadful sufferings foretold to me by the Domina, and her prayers for my infant's death, on whom, though unborn, I already doted, were more than my exhausted frame could support. Uttering a deep groan, I fell senseless at the feet of my unrelenting enemy. I know not how long I remained in this situation, but I imagine that some time must have elapsed before my recovery, since it sufficed the prioress and her nuns to quit the cavern. When my senses returned, I found myself in silence and solitude. I heard not even the retiring footsteps of my persecutors. All was hushed, and all was dreadful. I had been thrown upon the bed of straw. The heavy chain which I had already eyed with terror was wound around my waist. And fastened me to the wall. A lamp, glimmering with dull, melancholy rays through my dungeon, permitted my distinguishing all its horrors. It was separated from the cavern by a low and irregular wall of stone. a large chasm was left open in it which formed the entrance. For door there was none. A leaden crucifix was in front of my straw couch. A tattered rug lay near me, as did also a chapelet of beads, and not far from me stood a pitcher of water and a wicker basket containing a small loaf and a bottle of oil to supply my lamp. With a despondent eye did I examine this scene of suffering. When I reflected that I was doomed to pass in it the remainder of my days, my heart was rent with bitter anguish. I had once been taught to look forward to a lot so different. At one time my prospects had appeared so bright, so flattering. Now all was lost to me. Friends, comfort, society, happiness. In one moment I was deprived of all. Dead to the world, dead to pleasure, I lived to nothing but the sense of misery. How fair did that world seem to me, from which I was forever excluded. Cow. Many loved objects did it contain, whom I never should behold again. As I threw a look of terror round my prison, as I shrunk from the cutting wind which howled through my subterraneous dwelling, the change seemed so striking, so abrupt, that I doubted its reality. That the Duc de Medina's niece, that the destined bride of the Marquis de las Cisternas, one bred up in affluence, related to the noblest families in Spain, and rich in a multitude of affectionate friends, that she should in one moment become a captive separated from the world forever, weighed down with chains and reduced to support life with the coarsest aliments, appeared a change so sudden and incredible that I believed myself the sport of some frightful vision, its continuance me of my mistake with both too much certitude. Every morning my hopes were disappointed. At length I abandoned all idea of escaping. I resigned myself to my fate, and only expected liberty when she came, the companion of death. My mental anguish, and the dreadful scenes in which I had been an actress, advanced the period of my labor. In solitude and misery, abandoned by all, unassisted by art, uncomforted by friendship, with pangs which if witnessed would have touched the hardest heart, was I delivered of my wretched burthen. It came alive into the world, but I knew not how to treat it, or by what means to preserve its existence. I could only bathe it with tears, warm it in my bosom, and offer up prayers for its safety. I was soon deprived of this mournful employment, the want of proper attendance, my ignorance how to nurse it, the bitter cold of the dungeon, and the unwholesome air which inflated its lungs, terminated my sweet babe's short and painful existence. It expired in a few hours after its birth, and I witnessed its death with agonies which beggar all description, but my grief was unavailing. My infant was no more, nor could all my sighs impart to its little tender frame the breath of a moment. I rent my winding sheet and wrapped in it my lovely child. I placed it on my bosom, its soft arm folded. Round my neck and its pale cold cheek resting upon mine. Thus did its lifeless limbs repose, while I covered it with kisses, talked to it, wept, and moaned over it without remission day or night. Camilla entered my prison regularly once every 24 hours to bring me food. In spite of her flinty nature, she could not behold the spectacle unmoved. She feared that grief so excessive would at length turn my brain, and in truth, I was not always in my proper senses. From a principle of compassion, she urged me to permit the corpse to be buried, but to this I never would consent. I vowed not to part with it while I had life. Its presence was my only comfort, and no persuasion could induce me to give it up. It soon became a mass of putridity, and to every eye was a loathsome and disgusting object, to every eye but a mother's. In vain did human feelings bid me recoil from this emblem of mortality. With repugnance I withstood and vanquished that repugnance. I persisted in holding my infant to my bosom, in lamenting it, loving it, adoring it. Hour after hour have I passed upon my sorry. Couch, contemplating what had once been my child, I endeavored to retrace its features through the livid corruption with which they were overspread. During my confinement, this sad occupation was my only delight, and at that time worlds should not have bribed me to give it up. Even when released from my prison, I brought away my child in my arms. The representations of my two kind friends, here she took the hands of the Marchioness and Virginia and pressed them alternately to her lips, at length persuaded me to resign my unhappy infant to the grave. Yet I parted from it with reluctance. However, reason at length prevailed. I suffered it to be taken from me, and it now reposes in consecrated ground. I before mentioned that regularly, once a day, Camilla brought me food. She sought not to embitter my sorrows with reproach. She bade me, 'tis true, resign all hopes of liberty and worldly happiness, but she encouraged me to bear with patience my temporary distress, and advised me to draw comfort from religion. My situation evidently affected her more than she ventured to express, but she believed that to extenuate my fault would make me less anxious to repent it. Often while her lips painted the enormity of my guilt in glaring colors, her eyes betrayed how sensible she was to my sufferings. In fact, I am certain that none of my tormentors, for the 3 other nuns entered my prison occasionally, were so much actuated by the spirit of oppressive cruelty as by the idea that to afflict my body was the only way to preserve my soul. Nay, even this persuasion might not have had such weight with them, and they might have thought my punishment too severe, had not their good dispositions been repressed by blind obedience to their superior. Her resentment existed in full force. My project of elopement having been discovered by the abbot of the Capuchins, she supposed herself lowered in his opinion by my disgrace, and in consequence her hate was inveterate. She told the nuns to whose custody I was committed that my fault was of the most heinous nature, that no sufferings could equal the offense, and that nothing could save me from eternal perdition but punishing my guilt with the utmost severity. The superior's word is an oracle to but too many of a convent's inhabitants. The nuns believed whatever the prioress chose to assert, though contradicted by reason and charity, they hesitated not to admit the truth of her arguments. They followed her injunctions to the very letter, and were fully persuaded that to treat me with lenity, or to show the least pity for my woes, would be a direct means to destroy my chance for salvation. Camilla, being most employed about me, was particularly charged by the prioress to treat me with harshness. In compliance with these orders, she frequently strove to convince me how just was my punishment and how enormous was my crime. She bade me think myself too happy in saving my soul by mortifying my body, and even threatened me sometimes with eternal perdition. Yet, as I before observed, she always concluded by words of encouragement and comfort, and though uttered by Camilla's lips, I easily recognized the domina's. Expressions. Once, and once only, the prioress visited me in my dungeon. She then treated me with the most unrelenting cruelty. She loaded me with reproaches, taunted me with my frailty, and when I implored her mercy, told me to ask it of heaven, since I deserved none on earth. She even gazed upon my lifeless infant without emotion, and when she left me, I heard her charge Camilla to increase the hardships of my captivity. Unfeeling woman, but let me check my resentment. She has expiated her errors by her sad and unexpected death. Peace be with her, and may her crimes be forgiven in heaven, as I forgive her my sufferings on earth. Thus did I drag on a miserable existence. Far from growing familiar with my prison, I beheld it every moment with new horror. The cold seemed more piercing and bitter, the air more thick and pestilential. My frame became weak, feverish, and emaciated. I was unable to rise from the bed of straw and exercise my limbs in the narrow limits to which the length of my chain permitted me to. Move. Though exhausted, faint, and weary, I trembled to profit by the approach of sleep. My slumbers were constantly interrupted by some obnoxious insect crawling over me. Sometimes I felt the bloated toad, hideous and pampered with the poisonous vapors of the dungeon, dragging his loathsome length along my bosom. Sometimes the quick cold lizard rused me, leaving his slimy track upon my face, and entangling itself in the tresses of my wild and matted hair. Often have I at waking found my fingers ringed with the long worms which bred in the corrupted flesh of my infant. At such times I shrieked with terror and disgust, and while I shook off the reptile, trembled with all a woman's weakness. Such was my situation when Camilla was suddenly taken ill. A dangerous fever, supposed to be infectious, confined her to her bed. Everyone except the lay sister appointed to nurse her avoided her with caution and feared to catch the disease. She was perfectly delirious and by no means capable of attending to me. The domina and the nuns, admitted to the mystery, had latterly given me over entirely to Camilla's care. In consequence, they busied themselves no more about me, and occupied by preparing for the approaching festival. It is more than probable that I never once entered into their thoughts. Of the reason of Camilla's negligence, I have been informed since my release by the Mother Saint Ursula. At that time I was very far from suspecting its cause. On the contrary, I waited for my gaoler's appearance at first with impatience, and afterwards with despair. One day passed away, another followed it, the third arrived. Still no Camilla, still no food. I knew the lapse of time by the wasting of my lamp, to supply which fortunately a week's supply of oil had been left me. I supposed either that the nuns had forgotten me, or that the domina had ordered them to let me perish. The latter idea seemed the most probable, yet so natural is the love of life that I trembled to find it true. Though embittered by every species of misery, my existence was still dear to me, and I dreaded to lose it. Every succeeding minute proved to me that I must abandon all hopes of relief. I was become an absolute skeleton. My eyes already failed me, and my limbs were beginning to stiffen. I could only express my anguish and the pangs of that hunger which gnawed my heartstrings by frequent groans, whose melancholy sound the vaulted roof of the dungeon re-echoed. I resigned myself to my fate. I already expected the moment of dissolution, when my guardian angel, when my beloved brother arrived in time to save me. My sight, grown dim and feeble at first, refused to recognize him, and when I did distinguish his features, the sudden burst of rapture was too much for me to bear. I was overpowered by the swell of joy at once more beholding a friend, and that a friend so dear to me. Nature could not support my emotions, and took her refuge in insensibility. You already know what are my obligations to the family of Villafranca, but what you cannot know is the extent of my gratitude, boundless as the excellence of my benefactors. Lorenzo, Raymond, names so dear to me, teach me to bear with fortitude this sudden transition from misery to bliss. So lately a captive, oppressed with chains, perishing with hunger, suffering every inconvenience of cold and want, hidden from the light, excluded from society, hopeless, neglected, and as I feared, forgotten, now restored to life and liberty, enjoying all the comforts of affluence and ease, surrounded by those who are most loved by me, and on the point of becoming his bride, who has long been wedded to my heart, my happiness is so exquisite, so perfect, that it spits it out. One only wish remains ungratified. It is to see my brother in his former health, and to know that Antonia's memory is buried in her grave. Granted this prayer, I have nothing more to desire. I trust that my past sufferings have purchased from heaven the pardon of my momentary weakness. That I have offended greatly and grievously, I am fully conscious. But let not my husband, because he once conquered my virtue, doubt the propriety of my future conduct. I have been frail and full of error, but I yielded not to the warmth of constitution. Raymond, affection for you betrayed me. I was too confident of my strength, but I depended no less on your honor than my own. I had vowed never to see you more. Had it not been for the consequences of that unguarded moment, my resolution had been kept. Fate willed it otherwise, and I cannot but rejoice at its decree. Still my conduct has been highly blamable, and while I attempt to justify myself, I blush at recollecting my imprudence. Let me then dismiss the ungrateful subject, first assuring you, Raymond, that you shall have no cause to repent our union, and that the more culpable have been the errors of your mistress, the more exemplary shall be the conduct of your wife. Here Agnes ceased, and the Marquis replied to her address in terms equally sincere and affectionate. Lorenzo expressed his satisfaction at the prospect of being so closely connected with the man for whom he had ever entertained the highest esteem. The Pope's bull had fully and effectually released Agnes from her. Religious engagements, the marriage was therefore celebrated as soon as the needful preparations had been made. For the Marquis wished to have the ceremony performed with all possible splendor and publicity. This being over, and the bride having received the compliments of Madrid, she departed with Don Raymond for his castle in Andalusia. Lorenzo accompanied them, as did also the Marchioness de Villafranca and her lovely daughter. It is needless to say that Theodore was of the party, and would be impossible to describe his joy at his master's marriage. Previous to his departure, the Marquis, to atone in some measure for his past neglect, made some inquiries relative to Elvira. Finding that she, as well as her daughter, had received many services from Leonela and Jacintha, he showed his respect to the memory of his sister-in-law by making the two women handsome presents. Lorenzo followed his example. Leonela was highly flattered by the attentions of noblemen so distinguished, and Jacintha blessed the hour on which her house was bewitched. On her side, Agnes failed not to reward her convent friends. The worthy Mother St. Ursula, to whom she owed her liberty, was named at her request superintendent of the Ladies of Charity. This was one of the best and most opulent societies throughout Spain. Bertha and Cornelia, not choosing to quit their friend, were appointed to principal charges in the same establishment. As to the nuns who had aided the domina in persecuting Agnes, Camilla, being confined by illness to her bed, had perished in the flames which consumed St. Clare's convent. Mariana, Alex, and Violante, as well as 2 more, had fallen victims to the popular rage. The 3 others who in council had supported the domina's sentence were severely reprimanded and banished to religious houses in obscure and distant provinces. Here they languished away a few years, ashamed of their former weakness and shunned by their companions with aversion and contempt. Nor was the fidelity of Flora permitted to go unrewarded, her wishes being consulted. She declared herself impatient to revisit her native land. In consequence, a passage was procured for her to Cuba, where she arrived in safety, loaded with the presents of Raymond and Lorenzo. The debts of gratitude discharged, Agnes was at liberty to pursue her favorite plan. Lodged in the same house, Lorenzo and Virginia were eternally together. The more he saw of her, the more was he convinced of her merit. On her part, she laid herself out to please, and not to succeed was for her impossible. Lorenzo witnessed with admiration her beautiful person, elegant manners, innumerable talents, and sweet disposition. He was also much flattered by her prejudice in his favor, which she had not sufficient art to conceal. However, his sentiments partook not of that ardent character which had marked his affection for Antonia. The image of that lovely and unfortunate girl still lived in his heart, and baffled all Virginia's efforts to displace it. Still, when the Duke proposed to him the match which he wished earnestly to take place, his nephew did not reject the offer. The urgent supplications of his friends and the lady's merit conquered his repugnance to entering into new engagements. He proposed himself to the Marquis de Villafranca, and was accepted with joy and gratitude. Virginia became his wife, nor did she ever give him cause to repent his choice. His esteem increased for her daily. Her unremitted endeavors to please him could not but succeed. His affection assumed stronger and warmer colors. Antonia's image was gradually effaced from his bosom, and Virginia became sole mistress of that heart which she well deserved to possess without a partner. The remaining years of Raymond and Agnes, of Lorenzo and Virginia, were happy as can be those allotted to mortals, born to be the prey of grief and sport of disappointment. The exquisite sorrows with which they had been afflicted made them think lightly of every succeeding woe. They had felt the sharpest darts in misfortune's quiver; those which remained appeared blunt in comparison. Having weathered fate's heaviest storms, they looked calmly upon its terrors, or, if ever they felt affliction's casual gales, they seemed to them gentle as zephyrs which breathe over summer seas. Chapter 12. On the day following Antonia's death, all Madrid was a scene of consternation and amazement. An archer who had witnessed the adventure in the sepulchre had indiscreetly related the circumstances of the murder. He had also named the perpetrator. The confusion was without example which this intelligence raised among the devotees. Most of them disbelieved it and went themselves to the abbey to ascertain the fact. Anxious to avoid the shame to which their superior's ill conduct exposed the whole brotherhood, the monks assured the visitors that Ambrosio was prevented from receiving them as usual by nothing but illness. This attempt was unsuccessful, the same excuse being repeated day after day. The archer's story gradually obtained confidence. His partisans abandoned him. No one entertained a doubt of his guilt. and they who before had been the warmest in his praise were now the most vociferous in his condemnation. While his innocence or guilt was debated in Madrid with the utmost acrimony, Ambrosio was a prey to the pangs of conscious villainy and the terrors of punishment impending over him. When he looked back to the eminence on which he had lately stood, universally honored and respected, at peace with the world and with himself, scarcely could he believe that he was indeed the culprit whose crimes and whose fate he trembled to envisage. But a few weeks had elapsed since he was pure and virtuous, courted by the wisest and noblest in Madrid, and regarded by the people with a reverence that approached idolatry. He now saw himself stained with the most loathed and monstrous sins, the object of universal execration, a prisoner of the Holy Office, and probably doomed to perish in tortures the most severe. He could not hope to deceive his judges. The proofs of his guilt were too strong. His being in the sepulchre at so late an hour, his confusion at the discovery, the dagger which in his first alarm he owned had been concealed by him, and the blood which had spirted upon his habit from Antonia's wound, sufficiently marked him out for the assassin. He waited with agony for the day of examination. He had no resource to comfort him in his. Distress. Religion could not inspire him with fortitude. If he read the books of morality which were put into his hands, he saw in them nothing but the enormity of his offenses. If he attempted to pray, he recollected that he deserved not heaven's protection, and believed his crime so monstrous as to baffle even God's infinite goodness. For every other sinner, he thought there might be hope, but for him there could be none. Shuddering at the past, anguished by the present, and dreading the future thus past, he the few days preceding that which was marked for his trial. That day arrived. At 9 in the morning his prison door was unlocked, and his gaoler entering, commanded him to follow him. He obeyed with trembling. He was conducted into a spacious hall hung with black cloth. At the table sat 3 grave, stern-looking men, also habited in black. One was the Grand Inquisitor, whom the importance of this cause had induced to examine into it himself. At a smaller table at a little distance sat the secretary, provided with all necessary. Implements for writing. Ambrosio was beckoned to advance and take his station at the lower end of the table. As his eye glanced downwards, he perceived various iron instruments lying scattered upon the floor. Their forms were unknown to him, but apprehension immediately guessed them to be engines of torture. He turned pale, and with difficulty prevented himself from sinking upon the ground. Profound silence prevailed, except when the inquisitors whispered a few words among themselves mysteriously. Near an hour passed away, and with every second of it, Ambrosio's fears grew more poignant. At length the small door, opposite to that by which he had entered the hall, grated heavily upon its hinges. An officer appeared, and was immediately followed by the beautiful Matilda. Her hair hung about her face wildly. Her cheeks were pale, and her eyes sunk and hollow. She threw a melancholy look upon Ambrosio. He replied by one of aversion and reproach. She was placed opposite to him. A bell then sounded. Thrice. It was a signal for opening the court, and the inquisitors entered upon their office. In these trials neither the accusation is mentioned or the name of the accuser. The prisoners are only asked whether they will confess. If they reply that having no crime they can make no confession, they are put to the torture without delay. This is repeated at intervals, either till the suspected avow themselves culpable or the perseverance of the examinants is worn out and exhausted, but without a direct acknowledgment of their guilt, the Inquisition never pronounces the final doom of its prisoners. In general, much time is suffered to elapse without their being questioned, but Ambrosio's trial had been hastened on account of a solemn auto de fe which would take place in a few days, and in which the inquisitors meant this distinguished culprit to perform a part and give a striking testimony of their vigilance. The abbot was not merely accused of rape and murder, the crime of sorcery was laid to his charge, as well as to Matilda's. She had been seized as an accomplice in Antonia's assassination. On searching her cell, various suspicious books and instruments were found which justified the accusation brought against her. To criminate the monk, the constellated mirror was produced, which Matilda had accidentally left in his chamber. The strange figures engraved upon it caught the attention of Don Ramirez while searching the abbot's cell. In consequence, he carried it away with him. It was shown to the Grand Inquisitor, who, having considered it for some time, took off a small golden cross which hung at his girdle and laid it upon the mirror. Instantly a loud noise was heard, resembling a clap of thunder, and the steel shivered into 1,000 pieces. This circumstance confirmed the suspicion of the monk's having dealt in magic. It was even supposed that his former influence over the minds of the people was entirely to be ascribed to witchcraft. Determined to make him confess not only the crimes which he had committed, but those also of which he was innocent, the inquisitors began their examination. Though dreading the tortures, as he dreaded death still more which would consign him to eternal torments, the abbot asserted his purity in a voice bold and resolute. Matilda followed his example, but spoke with fear and trembling. Having in vain exhorted him to confess, the inquisitors ordered the monk to be put to the question. The decree was immediately executed. Ambrosio suffered the most excruciating pangs that ever were invented by human cruelty. Yet so dreadful is death when guilt accompanies it, that he had sufficient fortitude to persist in his disavowal. His agonies were redoubled in consequence, nor was he released till, fainting from excess of pain, insensibility rescued him from the hands of his tormentors. Matilda was next ordered to the torture, but terrified by the sight of the friar's sufferings, her courage totally deserted her. She sank upon her knees, acknowledged her corresponding with infernal spirits, and that she had witnessed the monk's assassination of Antonia. But as to the crime of sorcery, she declared herself the sole criminal, and Ambrosio perfectly innocent. The latter assertion met with no credit. The abbot had recovered his senses in time to hear the confession of his accomplice, but he was too much enfeebled by what he had already undergone to be capable at that time of sustaining new torments. He was commanded back to his cell, but first informed that as soon as he had gained strength sufficient, he must prepare himself for a second examination. The inquisitors hoped that he would then be less hardened and obstinate. To Matilda, it was announced that she must expiate her crime in fire on the approaching auto de fe. All her tears and entreaties could procure no mitigation of her doom, and she was dragged by force from the hall of trial. Returned to his dungeon, the sufferings of Ambrosio's body were far more supportable than those of his mind. His dislocated limbs, the nails torn from his hands and feet, and his fingers mashed and broken by the pressure of screws, were far surpassed in anguish by the agitation of his soul and vehemence of his terrors. He saw that, guilty or innocent, his judges were bent upon condemning him. The remembrance of what his denial had already cost him terrified him at the idea of being again applied to the question, and almost engaged him to confess his crimes. Then again the consequences of his confession flashed before him and rendered him once more irresolute. His death would be inevitable, and that a death the most dreadful. He had listened to Matilda's doom and doubted not that a similar was reserved for him. He shuddered at the approaching auto da fe, at the idea of perishing in flames, and only escaping from endurable torments to pass into others more subtile and everlasting. With affright did he bend his mind's eye on the space beyond the grave, nor could hide from himself. How justly he ought to dread heaven's vengeance. In this labyrinth of terrors, fain would he have taken his refuge in the gloom of atheism, fain would he have denied the soul's immortality, have persuaded himself that when his eyes once closed, they would never more open, and that the same moment would annihilate his soul and body. Even this resource was refused to him. To permit his being blind to the fallacy of this belief, his knowledge was too extensive, his understanding too solid and just. He could not help feeling the existence of a God. Those truths, once his comfort, now presented themselves before him in the clearest light, but they only served to drive him to distraction. They destroyed his ill-grounded hopes of escaping punishment, and dispelled by the irresistible brightness of truth and conviction, philosophy's deceitful vapors faded away like a dream. In anguish almost too great for mortal frame to bear, he expected the time when he was again to be examined. He busied himself in planning ineffectual schemes for escaping both present and future punishment. Of the first there was no possibility. Of the second, despair made him neglect the only means. While reason forced him to acknowledge a God's existence, conscience made him doubt the infinity of his goodness. He disbelieved that a sinner like him could find mercy. He had not been deceived into error. Ignorance could furnish him with no excuse. He had seen vice in her true colors. Before he committed his crimes, he had computed every scruple of their weight, and yet he had committed them. Pardon? He would cry in an access of frenzy. Oh, there can be none for me! Persuaded of this, instead of humbling himself in penitence, of deploring his guilt, and employing his few remaining hours in deprecating heaven's wrath, he abandoned himself to the transports of desperate rage. He sorrowed for the punishment of his crimes, not their commission, and exhaled his bosom's anguish. In idle sighs and vain lamentations, in blasphemy and despair. As the few beams of day which pierced through the bars of his prison window gradually disappeared, and their place was supplied by the pale and glimmering lamp, he felt his terrors redouble, and his ideas become more gloomy, more solemn, more despondent. He dreaded the approach of sleep. No sooner did his eyes close, wearied with tears and watching, than the dreadful visions seemed to be realized on which his mind had dwelt during the day. He found himself in sulphurous realms and burning caverns, surrounded by fiends appointed his tormentors, and who drove him through a variety of tortures, each of which was more dreadful than the former. Amidst these dismal scenes wandered the ghosts of Elvira and her daughter. They reproached him with their deaths, recounted his crimes to the daemons, and urged them to inflict torments of cruelty yet more refined. Such were the pictures which floated before his eyes in sleep. They vanished, not till his repose was disturbed by excess of agony. Then would he start from the ground on which he had stretched himself, his brows running down with cold sweat, his eyes wild and frenzied, and he only exchanged the terrible certainty for surmises scarcely more supportable. He paced his dungeon with disordered steps. He gazed with terror upon the surrounding darkness, and often did he cry, "Oh!" Fearful is night to the guilty. The day of his second examination was at hand. He had been compelled to swallow cordials whose virtues were calculated to restore his bodily strength and enable him to support the question longer. On the night preceding this dreaded day, his fears for the morrow permitted him not to sleep. His terrors were so violent as nearly to annihilate his mental powers. He sat like one stupefied near the table on which his lamp was burning dimly. Despair chained up his faculties in idiotism, and he remained for some hours unable to speak or move, or indeed to think. "Look up, Ambrosio," said a voice in accents well known to him. The monk started and raised his melancholy eyes. Matilda stood before him. She had quitted her religious habit. She now wore a female dress, at once elegant and splendid. A profusion of diamonds blazed upon her robes, and her hair was confined by a coronet of roses. In her right hand she held a small book. A lively expression of pleasure beamed upon her countenance, but still it was mingled with a wild, imperious majesty which inspired the monk with awe, and repressed in some measure his transports at seeing her. "You here, Matilda?" he at length exclaimed. "How have you gained entrance? Where are your chains? What means this magnificence, and the joy which sparkles in your eyes? Have our judges relented? Is there a chance of my escaping? Answer me for pity, and tell me what I have to hope or fear." "Ambrosio," she replied with an air of commanding dignity, "I have baffled the Inquisition's fury. I am free. A few moments will place kingdoms between these dungeons and me. Yet I purchase my liberty at a dreadful price. Dare you pay the same, Ambrosio? Dare you spring without fear over the bounds which separate men from angels?" You are silent. You look upon me with eyes of suspicion and alarm. I read your thoughts and confess their justice. Yes, Ambrosio, I have sacrificed all for life and liberty. I am no longer a candidate for heaven. I have renounced God's service and am enlisted beneath the banners of his foes. The deed is past recall, yet were it in my power to go back, I would not. Oh, my friend, to expire in such torments, to die amidst curses and execrations, to bear the insults of an exasperated mob, to be exposed to all the mortifications of shame and infamy. Who can reflect without horror on such a doom? Let me then exult in my exchange. I have sold distant and uncertain happiness for present and secure. I have preserved a life which otherwise I had. Lost in torture, and I have obtained the power of procuring every bliss which can make that life delicious. The infernal spirits obey me as their sovereign. By their aid shall my days be passed in every refinement of luxury and voluptuousness. I will enjoy unrestrained the gratification of my senses. Every passion shall be indulged, even to satiety. Then will I bid my servants invent new pleasures to revive and stimulate my glutted appetites. I go impatient to exercise my newly gained dominion. I pant to be at liberty. Nothing should hold me one moment longer in this abhorred abode, but the hope of persuading you to follow my example. Ambrosio, I still love you. Our mutual guilt and danger have rendered you dearer to me than ever, and I would fain save you from impending destruction. Summon then your resolution to your aid, and renounce for immediate and certain benefits the hopes of a salvation, difficult to obtain, and perhaps altogether erroneous. Shake off the prejudice of vulgar souls, abandon a God who has abandoned you, and raise yourself to the level of superior beings. She paused for the monk's reply. He shuddered while he gave it. "Matilda," he said, after a long silence in a low and unsteady voice, "what price gave you for liberty?" She answered him firm and dauntless. "Ambrosio, it was my soul." "Wretched woman, what have you done? Pass but a few years, and how dreadful will be your sufferings. Weak man, pass but this night, and how dreadful will be your own. Do you remember what you have already endured? Tomorrow you must bear torments doubly exquisite. Do you remember the horrors of a fiery punishment? In 2 days you must be led a victim to the stake. What then will become of you? Still dare you hope for pardon? Still are you beguiled with visions of salvation? Think upon your crimes. Think upon your lust, your perjury, inhumanity, and hypocrisy. Think upon the innocent blood which cries to the throne of God for vengeance, and then hope for mercy. Then dream of heaven, and sigh for worlds of light, and realms of peace and pleasure. Absurd! Open your eyes, Ambrosio, and be prudent. Hell is your lot. You are doomed to eternal perdition. Not lies beyond your grave, but a gulf of devouring flames. And will you then speed towards that hell? Will you clasp that perdition in your arms ere 'tis needful? Will you plunge into those flames while you still have the power to shun them? 'Tis a madman's action. No, no, Ambrosio, let us for a while fly from divine vengeance. Be advised by me, purchase by one moment's courage the bliss of years, enjoy the present, and forget that a future lags behind. Matilda, your counsels are dangerous. I dare not, I will not follow them. I must not give up my claim to salvation. Monstrous are my crimes, but God is merciful, and I will not despair of pardon. Is such your resolution? I have no more to say. I speed to joy and liberty, and abandon you to death and eternal torments. Yet stay one moment, Matilda. You command the infernal demons. You can force open these prison doors. You can release me from these chains which weigh me down. Save me, I conjure you, and bear me from these fearful abodes. You ask the only boon beyond my power to bestow. I am forbidden to assist a churchman and a partisan of God. Renounce those titles and command me. I will not sell my soul to perdition. Persist in your obstinacy till you find yourself at the stake. Then will you repent your error and sigh for escape when the moment is gone by. I quit you, yet ere the hour of death arrives, should wisdom enlighten you, listen to the means of repairing your present fault. I leave with you this book. Read the 4 first lines of the 7th page backwards. The spirit whom you have already once beheld will immediately appear to you. If you are wise, we shall meet again. If not, farewell forever. She let the book fall upon the ground. A cloud of blue fire wrapped itself round her. She waved her hand to Ambrosio and disappeared. The momentary glare which the flames poured through the dungeon, on dissipating suddenly, seemed to have increased its natural gloom. The solitary lamp scarcely gave light sufficient to guide the monk to a chair. He threw himself into a seat, folded his arms, and leaning his head upon the table, sank into reflections perplexing and unconnected. He was still in this attitude when the opening of the prison door roused him from his stupor. He was summoned to appear before the Grand Inquisitor. He rose and followed his gaoler with painful steps. He was led into the same hall, placed before the same examiners, and was again interrogated whether he would confess. He replied as before that having no crimes, he could acknowledge none. But when the executioners prepared to put him to the question, when he saw the engines of torture and remembered the pangs which they had already inflicted, his resolution failed him entirely. Forgetting the consequences, and only anxious to escape the terrors of the present moment, he made an ample confession. He disclosed every circumstance of his guilt, and owned not merely the crimes with which he was charged, but those of which he had never been suspected. Being interrogated as to Matilda's flight, which had created much confusion, he confessed that she had sold herself to Satan, and that she was indebted to sorcery for her escape. He still assured his judges that for his own part he had never entered into any compact with the infernal spirits, but the threat of being tortured made him declare himself to be a sorcerer and heretic. And whatever other title the inquisitors chose to fix upon him. In consequence of this avowal, his sentence was immediately pronounced. He was ordered to prepare himself to perish in the auto de fe, which was to be solemnized at 12 o'clock that night. This hour was chosen from the idea that the horror of the flames being heightened by the gloom of midnight, the execution would have a greater effect upon the mind of the people. Ambrosio, rather dead than alive, was left alone in his dungeon. The moment in which this terrible decree was pronounced had nearly proved that of his dissolution. He looked forward to the morrow with despair, and his terrors increased with the approach of midnight. Sometimes he was buried in gloomy silence. At others he raved with delirious passion, wrung his hands, and cursed the hour when he first beheld the light. In one of these moments his eye rested upon Matilda's mysterious gift. His transports of rage were instantly suspended. He looked earnestly at the book. He took it up, but immediately threw it from him with horror. He walked rapidly up and down his dungeon, then stopped, and again fixed his eyes on the spot where the book had fallen. He reflected that here at least was a resource from the fate which he dreaded. He stooped and took it up a second time. He remained for some time trembling and irresolute. He longed to try the charm, yet feared its consequences. The recollection of his sentence at length fixed his indecision. He opened the volume, but his agitation was so great that he at first sought in vain for the page mentioned by Matilda. Ashamed of himself, he called all his courage to his aid. He turned to the 7th leaf. He began to read it aloud, but his eyes frequently wandered from the book, while he anxiously cast them round in search of the spirit whom he wished, yet dreaded to behold. Still he persisted in his design, and with a voice unassured and frequent interruptions, he contrived to finish the 4 first lines of the page. They were in a language whose import was totally unknown to him. Scarce had he pronounced the last word when the effects of the charm were evident. A loud burst of thunder was heard. The prison shook to its very foundations. A blaze of lightning flashed through the cell, and in the next moment, borne upon sulphurous whirlwinds, Lucifer stood before him a second time. But he came not, as when at Matilda's summons he borrowed the seraph's form to deceive Ambrosio. He appeared in all that ugliness which since his fall from heaven had been his portion. His blasted limbs still bore marks of the Almighty's thunder. A swarthy darkness spread itself over his gigantic form. His hands and feet were armed with long talons. Fury glared in his eyes, which might have struck the bravest heart with terror. Over his huge shoulders waved 2 enormous sable wings, and his hair was supplied by living snakes, which twined themselves round his brow with fertile fixing forth. In one hand he held a roll of parchment, and in the other an iron pen. Still the lightning flashed. around him, and the thunder with repeated bursts seemed to announce the dissolution of nature. Terrified at an apparition so different from what he had expected, Ambrosio remained gazing upon the fiend, deprived of the power of utterance. The thunder had ceased to roll. Universal silence reigned through the dungeon. "For what am I summoned hither?" said the demon, in a voice which sulphurous fogs had damped to hoarseness. At the sound, nature seemed to tremble. A violent earthquake rocked the ground, accompanied by a fresh burst of thunder, louder and more appalling than the first. Ambrosio was long unable to answer the demon's demand. "I am condemned to die," he said with a faint voice, his blood running cold. While he gazed upon his dreadful visitor. "Save me, bear me from hence, shall the reward of my services be paid me? Dare you embrace my cause? Will you be mine, body and soul? Are you prepared to renounce him who made you, and him who died for you? Answer but yes, and Lucifer is your slave. Will no less price content you? Can nothing satisfy you but my eternal ruin? Spirit, you ask too much. Yet convey me from this dungeon, be my servant for 1 hour, and I will be yours for 1,000 years. Will not this offer suffice? It will not. I must have your soul, must have it mine, and mine forever. Insatiate daemon, I will not doom myself to endless torments. I will not give up my hopes of being one day pardoned. You will not? On what chimera rest then your hopes? Short-sighted mortal! Miserable wretch, are you not guilty? Are you not infamous in the eyes of men? And angels, can such enormous sins be forgiven? Hope you to escape my power? Your fate is already pronounced. The Eternal has abandoned you. Mine you are marked in the book of destiny, and mine you must and shall be. Fiend, 'tis false. Infinite is the Almighty's mercy, and the penitent shall meet his forgiveness. My crimes are monstrous, but I will not despair of pardon haply, when they have received due chastisement. Chastisement? Was purgatory meant for guilt like yours? Hope you that your offenses shall be bought off by prayers of superstitious stoics and droning monks? Ambrosio, be wise. Mine you must be. You are doomed to flames, but may shun them for the present. Sign this parchment, I will bear you from hence, and you may pass your remaining years in bliss and liberty. Enjoy your existence, indulge in every pleasure to which appetite may lead you, but from the moment that it quits your body, remember that your soul belongs to me, and that I will not be defrauded of my right." The monk was silent, but his looks declared that the tempter's words were not thrown away. He reflected on the conditions proposed with horror. On the other hand, he believed himself doomed to perdition, and that, by refusing the daemon's succor, he only hastened tortures which he never could escape. The fiend saw that his resolution was shaken. He renewed his instances and endeavored to fix the abbot's indecision. He described the agonies of death in the most terrific colors, and he worked so powerfully upon Ambrosio's despair and fears that he prevailed upon him to receive the parchment. He then struck the iron pen, which he held into a vein of the monk's left hand. It pierced deep, and was instantly filled with blood. Yet Ambrosio felt no pain from the wound. The pen was put into his hand. It trembled. The wretch placed the parchment on the table before him and prepared to sign it. Suddenly, he held his hand, he started away hastily and threw the pen upon the table. "What am I doing?" he cried. Then turning to the fiend with a desperate air, "Leave me, begone, I will not sign the parchment." "Fool!" exclaimed the disappointed demon. Darting looks so furious as penetrated the friar's soul with horror. "Thus am I trifled with. Go then! Rave in agony, expire in tortures, and then learn the extent of the Eternal's mercy. But beware how you make me again your mock. Call me no more till resolved to accept my offers." Summon me a second time to dismiss me thus idly, and these talons shall rend you into 1,000 pieces. Speak yet again. Will you sign the parchment? I will not. Leave me. Away. Instantly the thunder was heard to roll horribly. Once more the earth trembled with violence, the dungeon resounded with loud shrieks, and the daemon fled with blasphemy and curses. At first, the monk rejoiced at having resisted the seducer's arts and obtained a triumph over mankind's enemy. But as the hour of punishment drew near, his former terrors revived in his heart. Their momentary repose seemed to have given them fresh vigor. The nearer that the time approached, the more did he dread appearing before the throne of God. He shuddered to think how soon he must be plunged into eternity, how soon meet the eyes of his Creator, whom he had so grievously offended. The bell announced midnight. It was the signal for being led to the stake. As he listened to the first stroke, the blood ceased to circulate in the abbot's veins. He heard death and torture murmured in each succeeding sound. He expected to see the archers entering his prison, and as the bell forbore to toll, he seized the magic volume in a fit of despair. He opened it, turned hastily to the 7th page, and as if fearing to allow himself a moment's thought, ran over the fatal lines with rapidity. Accompanied by his former terrors, Lucifer again stood before the trembler. "You have summoned me," said the fiend. "Are you determined to be wise? Will you accept my conditions? You know them already. Renounce your claim to salvation, make over to me your soul, and I bear you from this dungeon instantly. Yet is it time? Resolve, or it will be too late. Will you sign the parchment? I must. Fate urges me. I accept your conditions. Sign the parchment," replied the demon in an exulting tone. The contract and the bloody pen still lay upon the table. Ambrosio drew near it. He prepared to sign his name. A moment's reflection made him hesitate. "Hark!" cried the tempter. "They come! Be quick! Sign the parchment, and I bear you from hence this moment." In effect, the archers were heard approaching, appointed to lead Ambrosio to the stake. The sound encouraged the monk in his resolution. "What is the import of this writing?" said he. "It makes your soul over to me forever and without reserve. What am I to receive in exchange?" "My protection and release from this dungeon. Sign it, and this instant I bear you away." Ambrosio took up the pen. He set it to the parchment. Again his courage failed him. He felt a pang of terror at his heart, and once more threw the pen upon the table. "Wheat and purl!" cried the exasperated fiend. "Away with this folly! Sign the writing this instant, or I sacrifice you to my rage." At this moment the bolt of the outward door was drawn back. The prisoner heard the rattling of chains. The heavy bar fell. The archers were on the point of entering. Worked up to frenzy by the urgent danger, shrinking from the approach of death, terrified by the demon's threats, and seeing no other means to escape destruction, the wretched monk complied. He signed the fatal contract and gave it hastily into the evil spirit's hands, whose eyes, as he received the gift, glared with malicious rapture. "Take it," said the god abandoned. "Now then save me, snatch me from hence. Hold, do you freely and absolutely renounce your Creator and His Son?" "I do. I do." "Do you make over your soul to me forever?" "Forever." without reserve or subterfuge, without future appeal to the divine mercy? The last chain fell from the door of the prison. The key was heard turning in the lock. Already the iron door grated heavily upon its rusty hinges. "I am yours forever and irrevocably," cried the monk, wild with terror. "I abandon all claim to salvation. I own no power but yours. Hark! Hark! They come! Oh, save me! Bear me away. I have triumphed. You are mine past reprieve, and I fulfill my promise." While he spoke, the door unclosed. Instantly, the daemon grasped one of Ambrosio's arms, spread his broad pinions, and sprang with him into the air. The roof opened as they soared upwards and closed again when they had quitted the dungeon. In the meanwhile, the gaoler was thrown into the utmost surprise by the disappearance of his prisoner. Though neither he nor the archers were in time to witness the monk's escape, a sulphurous smell prevailing through the prison sufficiently informed them by whose aid he had been liberated. They hastened to make their report to the Grand Inquisitor. The story, how a sorcerer had been carried away by the devil, was soon noised about Madrid, and for some days the whole city was employed in discussing the subject. Gradually it ceased to be the topic of conversation. Other adventures arose whose novelty engaged universal attention, and Ambrosio was soon forgotten as totally as if he never had existed. While this was passing, the monk, supported by his infernal guide, traversed the air with the rapidity of an arrow, and a few moments placed him upon a precipice's brink, the steepest in Sierra Morena. Though rescued from the Inquisition, Ambrosio as yet was insensible of the blessings of liberty. The damning contract weighed heavy upon his mind, and the scenes in which he had been a principal actor had left behind them such impressions as rendered his heart the seat of anarchy and confusion. The objects now before his eyes, and which the full moon sailing through clouds permitted him to examine, were ill calculated to inspire that calm of which he stood so much in need. The disorder of his imagination was increased by the wildness of the surrounding scenery, by the gloomy caverns and steep rocks rising above each other and dividing the passing clouds. Solitary clusters of trees scattered here and there, among whose thick-twined branches the wind of night sighed hoarsely and mournfully, the shrill cry of mountain eagles who had built their nests among these lonely desarts, the stunning roar of torrents, as swelled by late rains they rushed volatile, the brom piety vox baubt, but a bright seeing with it. The abbot cast round him a look of terror. His infernal conductor was still by his side, and eyed him with a look of mingled malice, exultation, and contempt. "Whither have you brought me?" said the monk at length in an hollow, trembling voice. "Why am I placed in this melancholy scene? Bear me from it quickly. Carry me to Matilda." The fiend replied not, but continued to gaze upon him in silence. Ambrosio could not sustain his glance. He turned away his eyes, while thus spoke the daemon. "I have him then in my power, this model of piety, this being without reproach, this mortal who placed his puny virtues on a level with those of angels. He is mine, irrevocably, eternally mine. Companions of my sufferings, denizens of hell, how grateful will be my present." He paused, then addressed himself to the monk. "Carry you to Matilda?" he continued, repeating Ambrosio's words. "Wretch, you shall soon be with her. You well deserve a place near her, for hell boasts no miscreant more guilty than yourself. Hark, Ambrosio, while I unveil your crimes. You have shed the blood of two innocents. Antonia and Elvira perished by your hand. That Antonia, whom you violated, was your sister. That Elvira, whom you murdered, gave you birth. Tremble, abandon hypocrisy, Inhuman parricide, incestuous ravisher, tremble at the extent of your offenses. And you it was who thought yourself proof against temptation, absolved from human frailties, and free from error and vice. Is pride then a virtue? Is inhumanity no fault? No, vain man, that I long have marked you for my prey. I watched the movements of your heart. I saw that you were virtuous from vanity, not principle, and I seized the fit moment of seduction. I observed your blind idolatry of the Madonna's picture. I bade a subordinate but crafty spirit assume a similar form, and you eagerly yielded to the blandishments of Matilda. Your pride was gratified by her flattery, your lust. Only needed an opportunity to break forth. You ran into the snare blindly and scrupled not to commit a crime which you blamed in another with unfeeling severity. It was I who threw Matilda in your way. It was I who gave you entrance to Antonia's chamber. It was I who caused the dagger to be given you which pierced your sister's bosom. And it was I who warned Elvira in dreams of your designs upon her daughter, and thus, by preventing your profiting by her sleep, compelled you to add rape as well as incest to the catalogue of your crimes. Hear, hear, Ambrosio. Had you resisted me 1 minute longer, you had saved your body and soul. The guards whom you heard at your prison door came to signify your pardon. But I had already triumphed. My plots had already succeeded. Scarcely could I propose crimes so quick as you performed them. You are mine, and heaven itself cannot rescue you from my power. Hope not that your penitence will make void our contract. Here is your bond signed with your blood. You have given up your claim to mercy, and nothing can restore to you the rights which you have foolishly resigned. Believe you that your secret thoughts escaped me? No, no, I read them all. You trusted that you should still have time for repentance. I saw your artifice, knew its falsity, and rejoiced in deceiving the deceiver. You are mine beyond reprieve. I burn to possess my right, and alive you quit not these mountains. During the daemon's speech, Ambrosio had been stupefied by terror and surprise. This last declaration roused him. Not quit these mountains alive, he exclaimed. Perfidious, what mean you? Have you forgotten our contract? The fiend answered by a malicious laugh. Our contract? Have I not performed my part? What more did I promise than to save you from your prison? Have I not done so? Are you not safe from the... Inquisition safe from all but from me? Fool that you were to confide yourself to a devil. Why did you not stipulate for life and power and pleasure? Then all would have been granted. Now your reflections come too late. Miscreant, prepare for death. You have not many hours to live. On hearing this sentence, dreadful were the feelings of the devoted wretch. He sank upon his knees and raised his hands towards heaven. The fiend read his intention and prevented it. What? He cried, darting at him a look of fury. Dare you still implore the Eternal's mercy? Would you feign penitence, and again act an hypocrite's part? Villain, resign your hopes of pardon, thus I secure my prey. As he said this, darting his talons into the monk's shaven crown, he sprang with him from the rock. The caves and mountains rang with Ambrosio's shrieks. The demon continued to soar aloft till, reaching a dreadful height, he released the sufferer. Headlong fell the monk through the airy waste. The sharp point of a rock received him, and he rolled from precipice to precipice, till bruised and mangled he rested on the river's banks. Life still existed in his miserable frame. He attempted in vain to raise himself. His broken and dislocated limbs refused to perform their office. nor was he able to quit the spot where he had first fallen. The sun now rose above the horizon, its scorching beams darted full upon the head of the expiring sinner. Myriads of insects were called forth by the warmth. They drank the blood which trickled from Ambrosio's wounds. He had no power to drive them from him, and they fastened upon his sores, darted their stings into his body, covered him with their multitudes, and inflicted on him tortures the most exquisite and insupportable. The eagles of the rock tore his flesh piecemeal, and dug out his eyeballs with their crooked beaks. A burning thirst tormented him. He heard the river's murmur as it rolled beside him, but strove in vain to drag himself towards the sound. Blind, maimed, helpless, and despairing, venting his rage in blasphemy and curses, execrating his existence, yet dreading the arrival of death, destined to yield him up to greater torments, 6 miserable days did the villain languish. On the 7th a violent storm arose. The winds in fury rent up rocks and forests. The sky was now black with clouds, now sheeted with fire. The rain fell in torrents. It swelled the stream. The waves overflowed their banks. They reached the spot where Ambrosio lay, and when they abated, carried with them into the river the corse of the despairing monk. Haughty lady, why shrunk you back when yon poor frail one drew near? Was the air infected by her errors? Was your purity soiled by her passing breath? Ah, lady, smooth that insulting brow, stifle the reproach just bursting from your scornful lip, wound not a soul that bleeds already. She has suffered, suffers still. Her air is gay, but her heart is broken. Her dress sparkles, but her bosom groans. Lady, to look with mercy on the conduct of others is a virtue no less than to look with severity on your own thinness. The end. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey, the characters, and the world they carried with them. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows more timeless books to be shared with listeners around the world. Until next time, thank you for listening.